Okay, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us. We hope now that we've got our problems resolved. I'll just continue with my introduction from where I left off, just to let you know a little bit about MacKenzie. She has been studying what many may consider non-traditional content, such as metrics and other forms of data, and how that can be included in institutional repositories together with content more traditionally associated with IRs. And MacKenzie is very well qualified to address the subject of today's webinar. In the spring of this year, she participated in a program sponsored by the Coalition for Networked Information and made a presentation entitled Helping Researchers Manage Data, the Role of Research Libraries. I'm going to turn the program over to MacKenzie now, but just a reminder that she is very willing to take your questions. Please type them in the question box, and she will do her best to answer all of them either during pauses in her presentation or at the conclusion of the webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and after the webinar is over, you will receive an email with the link to the recording. And so now I'm going to turn the program over to MacKenzie.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Let me share my apologies also for the technical dilemmas and make sure that everybody is seeing my PowerPoint slides. I'll assume that's the case and get started. This presentation is at least an hour long, assuming you have a few questions along the way. So we will definitely be going past 3 o'clock. But feel free to drop off anytime you need to, and we'll try and make the slides available to you later if you can't stay. Fair enough? All right. So my outline today is that I will be talking about the general issue of what we consider research data to be, specific approaches to working with data in libraries and in institutional repositories, some problems that we've run into or concerns over the years with this type of information and special issues that it raises, and then finally a few minutes on the emerging national cyber infrastructure and the role of libraries and institutional repositories in that. So diving right in, I think I need to start off by saying that this is not a new problem. We've all been dealing with data for quite a long time, and if you've ever been to a faculty member's office, you may have seen a scene very similar to this, and I promised I wouldn't say whose office this was, but we've all been in them. This is the digital equivalent that we see today. The same amount of information in the same chaotic state, but it's almost all on tapes and DVDs and CDs and other digital media stored in people's desk drawers or wherever they've got a few inches of room to put it. And the problem that they're facing to professionally manage and archive this data is growing by the minute. It's important to sort of keep in mind that this problem, at least in the digital arena, is happening very rapidly. So the very first hard drive came out not 60 years ago and only stored 5 megabytes of information, while today a Google data center may have hundreds or thousands of storage devices, each of which holds more than 2 terabytes of data. So the problem is escalating so fast that people can't really start to get their heads around it. One study that we did not too long ago was with the UCSD, University of California at San Diego, looking at just how much information there is in the world at large today. And an interesting finding from the community of researchers working on this is that the compound growth rate between now and a few years from now will be 60%. So clearly the problem is getting worse across the board, and certainly in the research community. So just a simple little example of that is Japan's equivalent of the US GenBank database, where the thing only started maybe 15 years ago, and over the past 10, the growth rate of deposits of gene sequence data has grown exponentially from only about 5 billion entries 10 years ago to over 400 billion now. So I'll just take a moment here to try and define what I mean by research data, because we all have different mental models of what that includes. So here is a very nice set of examples that the NSF was promoting. There are observational kinds of data which are taken from instruments or through something like a survey of people. There's experimental data that's done also with equipment or models of various kinds. There's simulation data that's produced by running software to generate data as if something were true. And then there's derived data, which is produced by mining other data or compiling a database of information and that kind of thing. And then lastly, the type that we're most familiar with in the library community, which is just multimedia data, images, audio, video, etc. The important thing to understand about this is how very expensive it is to create this data in the first place and how very impossible it can be often to reproduce it. So it falls into that category of rare and unique materials or special collections that libraries have historically managed. Some of the formats that we're seeing that are particularly commonplace are, of course, text files. And those come in a variety of flavors, which I'll show you a few of later. There's a lot of numerical data. This is slightly more familiar to libraries, things like SPSS, data sets from social science, and Excel and Access data from just random research projects. Multimedia data, of course, we've already talked about a little bit. Models are an interesting one, where you might have a three-dimensional model or a statistical model, which takes the form of software in a lot of cases. And then, of course, there is software for all kinds of purposes, which we also consider part of the research data in many cases. And this data can be domain-specific, where you really need to understand the particular schemata used in that discipline, or it can be instrument-specific. So you have a particular type of microscope that generates a data format that is unique and sometimes proprietary to that particular instrument. So here's just a simple example. This is an ASCII text file which would look to you like a document, except if you open it up and look at it, it doesn't make any sense to anybody without understanding how this data is coded, how it's structured. Another example is an image, which is just like every other image from the computer's point of view, but this particular image has meaning. It's a brain scan. So the important point to take away here is that in the world of research data management and archiving, it is absolutely essential that there be good metadata available for that data set. So for example, in the world of statistical data, you need a codebook to interpret something like that ASCII file we looked at a moment ago. In the case of an image, you would need protocol data to tell you how that image was generated, with what instrument, what all those colors meant. If it's an ASCII data file of any structure, you need to understand what the schema was. This is a little bit different than what we've dealt with traditionally in just straightforward documents and visual images, say art images, which are more common in our world. But it's good news for libraries that metadata is such a critical component of this. So I'm going to take just a minute to talk about what research data at a campus like MIT's looks like and where the libraries might fit into that. So we've recently run a study as part of that How Much Information program to build a set of 6 case studies in particular scientific areas that are very data intensive. And I'm going to give you 2 of those as examples of the kinds of information I'm talking about and why archiving and data management is such an issue for these. So let's start with the first case study involving neuroimaging. So in this case, we have several departments, labs, and centers at MIT that are studying behavioral science, neurology, and related fields, and they use a lot of imaging data in the pursuit of that research. And what they want to be able to do is combine those digital images, like the one you saw a few minutes ago, with other data that they have, either captured as part of that experiment or as a separate experiment on the same subjects. So they might have image data along with some ASCII text files that describe the patient or the subject of the study. They may have genomic data from the same person, or electroencephalograms or other kinds of sensor data from that same person, and they need to be able to bring all that together to answer their research questions. The amount of data involved can be very large. So for one group of 4 faculty here at MIT, they're producing over 10 terabytes of this image data every year, and that number is gated only by the number of magnetic resonance imaging machines that they have available. If they buy more equipment, they generate more data. And they've convinced me, at least, that the biggest problem they have is that this is incredibly expensive data to produce. Each run in one of these MRI machines costs them $1,000. So even if they could reproduce the data, it would cost too much money to do that. So it's really important to them to have that data archived in a way that lets them go back to it later, find it, interpret it, combine it with other data sets, reuse it, and so on. And that's very hard to do now. There are no national archives that have become prominent like GenBank for neurology data, so they really need help. Another case study we have is from the area of biological oceanography, and in particular a field called metagenomics. So what they're doing, first of all, this is combining a lot of different fields, from civil engineering to earth science. And what they want to do is combine genomic data that is drawn from nature, say an ocean water sample, with other biochemical data related to that sample. So for example, you might take a water sample, extract the genetic material from it, but then also record things like the chemical properties of the data at that moment in time, where it was taken, what its optical properties were, and so on. Again, the data produced is quite large. Not only do you have all that metadata about the site, but each run of a gene sequencer produces a terabyte of data, and they're running 2 or 3 per week now. Again, they just buy new equipment, generate more data as they need to, so the problem is growing very quickly. This data, as you can imagine, is completely irreplaceable because there's only one moment in time when you can take that ocean water sample, and if you take it again 5 years later, you're not going to get the same data. So if they're trying to study something like climate change, which has a longitudinal aspect, then it's very important that you be able to go back and look at the samples that were taken today or 5 years ago or 10 years ago and know that you're looking at the right data. So again, it's a rare and special collection that they need managed. And again, there's no existing database out there run by the government or any of the community that really solves this problem for them. So they're looking for help locally. So by studying a set of these communities of practice and what their data management issues are, we started to formulate a strategy for dealing with data in the library and how the institutional repositories might help us with that. But first I want to do just a quick recap of the history of data curation in libraries, because I want you to believe that this is not actually a new thing. Many, many, many research libraries have existing programs in managing statistical data in the social sciences in particular. So here at MIT we have a collaboration with Harvard, the Harvard-MIT Data Center, that goes back quite a long time, about 20 years. And they've been collecting this statistical data and managing it in the library all that time. I'll show you a little bit more about that in just a moment. We also have GIS, geospatial data, and I know of many other research libraries that are also managing that type of information. We have experts in bioinformatics data already on staff. We are managing digital library collections quite successfully, and we have begun to take general purpose data sets from other scientific disciplines into our own institutional repository. So the case I'm trying to make to you is that this is an incremental approach to dealing with data, and that people shouldn't be worried about the complexities and the scale of the data that we're talking about today, because we can get there incrementally, starting with expertise that we already have and software and services that we've already created. So here's an example from social science. This is MIT's web page for our social science data support service. You can go here anytime. It explains who the data services librarian is and what kinds of services she provides. It includes things like consultation to faculty, liaising with existing external national archives like ICPSR, helping develop metadata standards like DDI, which pertains to the social science data field, and maintaining that website. So this is a very well-liked service that we've had for at least 10 years and are building on. Similarly, we have a service for geospatial information that we've had for maybe 5 years that includes acquiring geospatial data sets that are needed by faculty and students here, cataloging them, making them available to the local community in a repository. It happens to be a specialized one because GIS data is very specialized, but this isn't particularly hard for us, and we're partnering with our local computer center for some of that technical support. And again, the librarian who supports this service offers consultation and exhaustive training. She's very popular teaching people how to use geospatial data. And her background is librarianship, so this was something that she learned as a specialty, but it's not that far removed from her traditional training. She acquires and catalogs data sets using the community standard in that, which is FGDC, and she maintains that website and the geodata repository that we manage. So kind of closing this up, we've launched a website that is more of a general purpose one for how people can think about managing and publishing their data. And it has all kinds of information about what issues you as the data producer should be thinking about, how you create a data management plan, what sorts of services we might provide you, where you can go for more information and help. We run training sessions like this Managing Research Data 101 class, and we're finding that this is very popular. It's a great need on campus and greatly appreciated. So that website that I just showed you is averaging around 650 hits a month and growing. It's only been up for a very short time, and it's already quite popular. And we've put together a team of public service librarians from across the libraries to think about our strategy for supporting data and how we can continue to grow this program while we do everything else. And finally, we do have a metadata services group, as many research libraries do, who can provide consultation if faculty or students need it for particular kinds of data that they're struggling with. Which brings me to how we handle archiving data today. And our institutional repository, as I'm sure many of you know, is called DSpace at MIT and is built with the DSpace open source software. So a lot of my examples today will draw from DSpace since it's the one I'm most familiar with, but I happen to know is also applicable to ePrints and Fedora and the other institutional repository platforms that are out there. So we are already today seeing data archived in our DSpace in all of these formats that you see here. Excel spreadsheets are very popular. Zip files, which I'll talk about more in a set of case studies coming up. XML files of data, various multimedia files. We are getting files that require very specific software programs in order to process or render them. We're getting Java applications that have been deposited, such as Java Web Start files. E-notebooks from labs because they have nowhere else to put them, and they're really anxious to get these archived. And then supplementary data for theses that are being published by MIT students. So just a few quick examples of these to give you a flavor. We have a social science department that's producing these statistical data sets in this data format. So they deposit a data set in this DTA format, and then they deposit an associated code book for it, which is just a Word file, and the two of them together allow you to interpret the data set. Another example is speech files. So this particular lab studies human speech, and this particular study was of American English in different parts of the country. So what they deposited was a set of sound files that are encoded as WAV files, and then a scanned map of the country, which are correlated so you can see which sound files came from which region of the country, and that's all explained in this third file, which is just a basic text README file. That's a very common kind of strategy. Another simple example comes from the field of synthetic biology, where they deposited a set of software files. These are Python files and related files that you need in order to compile that software. Some input data, which is just in a text format, and then another one of these Word document README files that explains how it all fits together. And I think the important thing from the last three examples to note is that the libraries didn't really have to do anything. We set up a community and a collection for these folks, and they were able to just upload their data and all of the accompanying documentation without our assistance. So this gives you options for how involved you want to be in this, which relates to how much of a commitment you want to make to people for actually helping preserve this data over time. And we'll get to that later. So I want to walk you through a set of about 4 little case studies of types of data that are archived today in institutional repositories and show you some of the data involved so you can get a sense of what this means. And then we'll talk about some of the issues that have come up as a result of taking this data here, at least. So the first one comes from MIT, and it's robotics data. So this is data that's come from a group who are learning how to build robots that scan physical space. So there was an existing archive of their material that got defunded. This is a very typical situation where some faculty member might have an existing repository that he or she created with some grant funding or something like that, and then the funding ends and the graduate student leaves, and they're suddenly sitting on quite a large data collection with no place to put it. So we're working with them to understand what it would take for us to take over this collection. And here's what we had to do. We had to create a local taxonomy for the metadata that they use for this type of material. We had to make a few minor changes to the way this data is displayed in DSpace, the item display. We made minor modifications to the submission form that they use to input the data and the workflow that they're using, because several of the steps that we had for documents just didn't make sense for data. We verified with them that if any submissions were made from outside MIT, that they would review that data for appropriateness or work with us to do that. And then finally, we just bulk loaded the data from the previous repository into DSpace and added a Creative Commons CC0 license to that, and I'll explain what that is a little bit later. As a result, you have this new community in DSpace at MIT that has a collection for this robotics data set. The important thing to note on this screen is that there is a lot of documentation here. This Carmen URL is particularly important. When you look at what's actually in one of the submissions you see there, here's an item record, and it contains the description explains what the data is and says quite clearly that there are 2 data files consisting of a Carmen log file and a Carmen map file, and the map file was constructed from the log file. So that explains what these files are, and then you need to go back and look at that Carmen link to see exactly how the Carmen data is structured. And then when you open the file, this is what it looks like, right? So you could not look at this file and interpret it without knowing what the structure is here, but the item record helps you do that by pointing you to where the documentation exists for this format. So that's a quick, simple example. And here's another one from our colleagues at the University of Cambridge, and in particular this Unilever Center for Molecular Informatics, which does chemistry and chemical data. And they've been doing this for quite a long time, where they set up their DSpace archive many years ago with an intention of supporting data archiving and data sharing, as you can see from this quote from their website. So they've really been trying to understand what it means for them to steward data in their institutional repository. So they've got a lot to share with us now. This is a page for the community homepage for this center, and it shows you that the 2 kinds of data that you have here are published papers, just like most institutional repositories have, and also data associated with those papers. When you go to the data collection, you see this list of data sets without a lot of information about what they are individually. But then if you go and look at one of them, they are encoded in a very popular schema, an XML schema called Chemical Markup Language, CML. So the data itself are just these little simple XML files for the chemical structure that they're representing. So they have a couple 100,000 of these little XML files in their institutional repository. Each of them is marked up in that CML markup language. So this is a standard that you can easily find on the web. And you get to this data. And what's interesting about this is that these data sets are XML files, but they're also text files, so they're being picked up and indexed by Google and Google Scholar. So the field that uses this data is just ecstatic, because now they can search for things like the chemical ID number in Google, and get straight to this record in DSpace at Cambridge, and then go and look at the related documents and papers that describe this kind of data. And it's been a big improvement for the field overall. So another quick case study comes from our colleagues at Cornell and their eCommons institutional repository. And they have a very interesting project going on there to examine how they can archive and steward scientific research data. So the example I'll show you today comes from this Upper Susquehanna River Basin project, part of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. And I'm not an expert on this particular type of data, but it was interesting to me to see how cleverly they went about this. So these are the items in this collection, and if you go to one of them, you can see that the actual data is described in this abstract, what it is, and then there's a description associated with that that kind of tells you what you're going to see, and it points in particular to this ecological metadata language, EML record, which is very key in this particular data collection. So we look at a record, and what we see is a zip file. This is very common. So all that was deposited to DSpace here was a zip file. But if you open the zip file, they've got a very standard way of structuring that. So there's a data folder, an export folder, and a metadata folder with predictable sorts of content in them, which is described over in the abstract and description field of the item record. So here's one of the examples from the data folder where you just have a simple Excel spreadsheet. Another example is one of these structured ASCII data files, which you've seen lots of examples of now. So that's the kind of thing that you find in the data folder. And then they use this ecological metadata EML schema to be able to describe what that data is in great detail. So here's the schema, the XML schema for that EML. And if I scroll down, this is a screenshot, but you can see that there's a lot of information here about that data set that we were just looking at. And they've even provided a nice HTML rendition of that so that you can go and just read what the data is about and then turn to the data file itself. And so I think this really does highlight the fact that you don't want to try to take this kind of metadata and cram it into the institutional repository's default metadata, the Dublin core, because there's too much variation and it's too rich. There really is, every data set may have different metadata associated with it, and you need to be able to support that. So we're really seeing this two levels of description, the very high-level description in the Dublin core metadata that's in the item record, and then this rich metadata that really gets into what the data set is, and that's stored as a file with the data. And I like the way Cornell did this because it's very predictable how you get from the data to the metadata about it. The last case study I wanted to share with you is from the UK. They have a very large government-funded program called DataShare, and this particular repository is out of the University of Edinburgh, and it's also working with this notion of how you can store data into an institutional repository. So here we have one where the data is described a little bit in the item record, which just explains what the data is. And it's got this funny format, NC. So what is that? And over here in the format column, if you follow it to the right, you can see that it's a NetCDF format. And this is an interesting one because NetCDF is not actually interpretable by eye. If you go to the documentation that this item record points to about NetCDF, it's actually a binary format that you need software to be able to read, which is actually similar to something like the MARC format. You can't actually open a MARC record and look at it without interpretive software. So this is a similar situation. And luckily they have this text file. If you look at the item record one more time, what you see are a set of these NetCDF files and then several text files, and the last one there is called README. And that's turning out to be the typical user-produced solution to this, is to create a README file. The one here just explains what all those other files are, what's in the text files, what's in the NetCDF files, and then you have to go and get the NetCDF software so that you can look at the data. But it's easy to get. So those are, you've probably noticed from that certain pattern emerging of how people are beginning to put this type of data into an existing institutional repository without having to do any changes to the system or really think hard about what their services might turn out to be. So let's talk about some of the issues that have emerged from research data that we should collectively be kind of worrying about as we start to get into this area. First of all, it's very important that data have citable, persistent, globally unique identifiers. One of the things we want to be able to achieve here is a sort of data publishing paradigm where you can write a paper and talk about a data set and then cite that data set in a way that's not confusing and is persistent over time. And most people trust the library to take on a piece of a data set, a file like this, and provide a link to it and then have that data set be there in the future. So it's really empowering authors to talk about their data in different ways because they're able to cite that data set and be confident that people will still be able to get to it in the future. The default in DSpace is to use a CNRI handle, which is the same technology behind DOIs. And interestingly, there's a new movement a new initiative that was started by the German National Library of Science and Technology. I'm not sure what the name of it is now, but they have become a DOI registration agency, and they are giving out DOIs for data sets that you register with them. So they run a registry, and they give you a DOI, and then you record that DOI in your institutional repository. And this is gaining a lot of traction with organizations like the ones you see here, the British Library, the French Institute for Scientific and Technical Information. They're forming a consortium to figure out how to make this DOI registration agency broader and more international and encourage its use for this type of material. So the point is that you can create a persistent identifier for a data set today using default technology from systems like DSpace. And then there are these initiatives coming up that are looking at this more strategically and holistically across software platforms and institutions. Another issue to be aware of is storage, okay? That when you're only keeping things like documents in institutional repositories, they're very small. But once you start to take things like media files, they get quite large. And when you get into scientific research data sets, they can become very, very large. So you need to be doing a lot more storage planning than we used to have to worry about. Luckily, the situation there has gotten much better in the past few years. So what we mostly do today is use locally based storage that our campus computer centers provide or that the library supports. Those can be just your institution, they can be consortial, but that's been sort of the model until now. What we're seeing today is that there are new storage services being offered by third-party so-called cloud providers like the Amazon S3 service, the Microsoft Azure service, and EMC's Atmos. So those are just 3 examples of cloud storage that you can buy now, and there are organizations like DuraCloud that are working on the integration of systems and platforms like DSpace and Fedora with these cloud-based storage services. So if this works out, what you would be able to do is deposit content to your IR, but have it be stored somewhere else in this cloud-based storage with a certain contract between you and the cloud provider through an organization like DuraCloud, for example, so that you're not actually having to plan how much storage you're going to need or maintain that. It's maintained by the third party. So I think storage used to be something we worried a lot about, but now it's becoming much more manageable. That means that you can use storage not just for the one copy that the researcher uploads, but for all your backup and replication needs as well. And we're working towards creating a scenario where you can define the policies for the data that you're trying to archive, or your depositors can, and that will be automatically enforced by the software and the storage that it's sitting on. So we're not quite there yet, but that's sort of the gold standard, is to have policy-driven architecture and infrastructure that supports your archiving policies. couple of other changes in the data storage arena that are very helpful to us. There is a standard emerging called XAM that the storage hardware industry is working on, all these companies like EMC and IBM and HP. So it's a Storage Network Industry Association standard, and what it does is define a common API between software and storage, which is something we, believe it or not, never had before, and it means that you can switch storage providers quite easily and keep the same software, which is good news in case one of those cloud providers goes away. It also means that you can switch applications and keep your data where it is. So if you switched from DSpace to Fedora, you'd be able to do that without having to migrate all your data from one platform to another. So this is going to be a great thing when we're talking about storing very large quantities of data and you don't want to have to be moving it around all the time. Another thing is certain companies like Sun have been doing a lot of very specialized work in this area of data management and data archiving and have come up with specialized sets of technology that work with products like Fedora and DSpace so that you can have kind of a turnkey system that has a very scalable storage platform and a known application running on top of it. You don't have to buy the application from them. So this Sun Open Archive framework is a good example of that. And they have actually begun to build in some of the policy things I was just talking about, like data integrity checks, so that if anything happens to your data, the system, the hardware, will actually report that to you and say, something bad happened, you've got to go and fix this. So that's the sort of support that we need from infrastructure that's going to make all of this much easier without libraries having to hire armies of data center operators to do this kind of thing. Turning now to metadata, I think you'll have seen from our earlier examples that the metadata you want for data is a mix of the traditional and the new. So this is some nice work that was done by that DataShare project in the UK by Robin Rice. And it provides a Dublin core schema for data that you can go and take a look at. I provided the URL here for that. And talks about the different data elements that they recommend for data sets. But I thought I'd just run through some of them very quickly so you can get a sense of what they include. And some of these should be, very familiar. They're just straightforward library type descriptive metadata elements that you can easily map into the Dublin core schema, such as the title, which is the name of the data set, or potentially the research project that created the data set, the researcher or set of researchers who were responsible for creating it, that unique identifier that I talked about a minute ago, which is a handle or a DOI or something like that, and then the subject of the data set. So those are kind of Dublin core-y type things. A few slightly different things are dates. It's very, very important with data to capture the project start and end dates and when the data was released from the project. A lot of times there will be multiple data sets from the same research project, and it's really important to be able to keep them in the right order. So these release dates are key ways of doing that. It also helps you with maintenance issues. If you need to go back and revisit data to check and make sure that it's still good, you need these dates. Many funders of research require that you cite them in association with the research data, so you might want to have metadata about who funded the research and potentially the grant number for that, language of the material if that's relevant, and things like physical location. Where was the data produced? If it's sensor data, it can be very important to have latitude and longitude type information about that. From, if you remember my example of the ocean water sample, where that sample came from is really, really important to them to know. Rights associated with the data, if there are any. A lot of data is produced under grants from corporations that may have patent rights to it, things like that. So it's important to capture that if it's known. And then a lot of times, one of the things you'll have noticed in those examples I gave were that you could end up with 2 or 3 or more files which have some relationship to each other. And sometimes it's not obvious what that relationship is, so it's good to have some place the inventory of all of the files and how they relate to each other. That was just the information for the project itself. And now, in addition to that, it's very important that you capture what the formats of the data are. And these examples that I've provided here are actually fairly poor, because the truth is a lot of data sets have a format of something like text, right, or a JPEG, as in the example here. And that really doesn't help you very much. It tells you that the data is in ASCII, but it doesn't tell you what kind of a file it is. So the next piece of metadata, the methodology, is really the key, where you have some metadata that describes how the data was produced, what equipment, what protocol, anything else that you would record in a lab notebook. You can reference a publication if there is one that describes that data, but that's really how people are going to figure out what the data is, not just the format of it. And then sources. If you have derived data where you say mined a large text collection to produce a data set, you want to be able to sort what that source was so that the data is reproducible. Lastly, it's good to have versions. Like I said, lots of research projects produce multiple versions of the data set or of their data results, and it's really important to be able to keep them in the right order. So we also recommend that you keep checksums, which are little codes that tell you, it's like a representation of the data file itself, so you can tell in a moment if anything in the data file changed, because the checksum would also change, and you can compare the checksums before and after. So it's a very important way to maintain that data over time, so it's important to produce them up front. Finally, explanation of codes. If you're using file naming conventions and you're retaining those file names, it's important to understand what the structure of the file name was, and any codes that you used in the data set itself. So, for example, lots of data has these values like 999 in it, which are not real values. They're just dummy values, but nobody would know that if you didn't mention it. So that's a lot of different things, and you capture all that together and you store it in a README file or something comparable to that along with the data set. All right. Moving on to preservation. This is actually quite easy for me to explain because either you know something about how to preserve digital data or you don't, but there's nothing about research data that's particularly different than all the other kinds of data that we're coping with. So that's good news, that the standard strategy that we use for digital preservation across the board is to try to identify neutral, standard formats that are software and hardware independent and capture the data in those formats. So a good example of that is XML. And to make multiple copies of the data so that if you lose one copy, you've got others to fall back to. And then produce as much documentation as possible about that data so that other people will be able to interpret it in the future. And those simple rules apply equally well to research data as to everything else we're capturing. The one thing about research data that is a little bit hairy is that so much of it depends on particular software to create it, to edit it, to process it, or to view it. So over and over again, you run into data files that you can't do anything with unless you have the software necessary to read it. So SPSS is a good example of that from the social science arena. That NetCDF format that we looked at for the ecological data, and then CATIA is an example of a 3D CAD software program where there's just no way to look at a 3D model that was produced with that software unless you have that software. So this is becoming a bit of a concern to us because it implies that not only will you keep the data, but you'll keep the software associated with that data. And that introduces a whole host of issues because often that software is licensed with a license key or something that would prevent you from using it in the future. Ideally, you would get the source code for the software, not just the binary file, because hardware changes and you want to be able to run this in the distant future. So there are lots of issues with archiving software that we haven't really figured out as a community yet. And sadly, data does tend to introduce the need for this unless you can ensure that it's in these standard neutral formats. Another angle on this that's kind of new is the aspect of data sharing. Increasingly, funding agencies like the National Institutes of Health are requiring researchers to share their data, which is a way of leveraging the investment that the funding agencies are making in the research. So they want the researchers to share their data with other researchers, and in some cases they're mandating that, like this 2003 rule that said that if the grant is more than $500,000, the PI has to provide a data sharing plan as part of the grant proposal. And so this is an area where the libraries have been quite helpful to the PIs by giving them a strategy for providing this data sharing plan that, you know, it's not perfect, but it's much better than what they would be able to do on their own. That, though, in turn raises this issue of, okay, what does it mean to share data? What's the legal framework around that? And again, this is something that not many people really understand very well. We've been working here with the Science Commons, which is an organization related to the Creative Commons that studies this particular issue. And the consensus is that, at least in the U.S., data is not actually copyrightable because it's facts. So because you can't copyright it, you can't use a Creative Commons license with it either. So a lot of researchers don't really understand the implication of that. It means that if I put a data set in a place like DSpace or any other institutional repository, it instantly becomes part of the public domain. They really lose control because they didn't own the copyright in the first place. So there is this new license that the Creative Commons has come up with called CCO that really makes that explicit and shows that the researcher does understand the technology, the legal implications of sharing their data in a public system like an institutional repository. And that means that what you really need to do is talk to researchers about the risks of having their data in an institutional repository and making it part of the public domain, meaning that they don't really control it from then on. And if there's any reason why they shouldn't share it, they should not put it in a public repository like your institutional repository. So what we've been telling people is that institutional repositories that we run at the library are a really good way for researchers to share their data because we support all of those things I was just talking about. We provide them with persistent identifiers that they can cite in their articles. We provide them with a way to comply with open access requirements or sharing requirements from their funders. We can support embargoes on that data if necessary. We commit to providing the long-term access to it to the degree that we're capable of that over time. And we make our institutional repositories and their metadata available to all the discovery engines like Google so that it gets much easier for people to find their data when they need to be able to test the results or reuse it or combine it with new data. So that concludes the part about kind of what is happening now and why we think that this is a valuable thing for the libraries to be doing. And if there are no particular questions, then I'll just wrap this up with a little bit of what's happening in the cyber infrastructure area. So moving right along. I'm sure many of you have heard of or read the 2003 so-called Atkins report to the National Science Foundation, which first really described this cyber infrastructure and pointed out that it is about the computing infrastructure involved and the networks and the storage. It's also about the data. The cyber infrastructure isn't just infrastructure, it's the information flowing through that infrastructure. And that includes, they said, observational data, experimental data, and so on, all of the things we've just been talking about. So in 2005, the National Science Board produced their report called Long Live Data Collections, Enabling Research and Education in the 21st Century, and created this brand new Office of Cyber Infrastructure, which is now a very large part of the National Science Foundation. And their job is to coordinate and support all of these aspects of cyber infrastructure. If you read this report, it makes a lot of mention of this notion of digital data curation, that's been sort of a missing part of the cyber infrastructure, is where are the equivalents of the library in the cyber infrastructure, and how can we make sure that those don't get left out? So around 2007, the Association of Research Libraries began working on this e-science agenda for research libraries. And just last year, the NSF commissioned a new Blue Ribbon Task Force to think about the sustainability of digital preservation and access with a focus on this kind of e-science data. So just nationally, there's been quite a lot of attention put on this issue. And I love this picture that the DataShare folks in the UK put together that shows kind of the continuum. So at the bottom you have the default, which is the researcher, that picture you saw at the very beginning, the researcher who's storing their data on a DVD or a tape and then throwing it in their desk drawer. And that goes kind of up through the ranks to the middle here, which is where you have things like professional metadata support, advice about formats, licensing, a place to put the data with a persistent identifier and format validation and so on. And then you move all the way up the stack to the very top, which is really the sort of international cyber infrastructure, the so-called data grid. And this is sort of beyond the capabilities of particular research libraries. So we fall kind of in this middle ground here, where we're doing a whole lot more with this data than an individual researcher would, but we're not pretending to become the ultimate solution, which is the Fermi Labs and Oak Ridge National Labs of the world. So that hopefully kind of positions what we're talking about here and where we fit into this ecosystem. So we really think that the main library role here, as supported by the institutional repositories, is to help researchers organize and annotate their data. We obviously can't do all of that annotation for them necessarily, maybe with them, but it requires quite a lot of expertise both in the subject of the research and sometimes the particulars of the data. Curation, which is the storage and preservation piece, and the publishing piece for discovery and access. And then what I call the last mile problem. And I see there's a question which I'll take in just a moment, but let me just say a word about this last mile problem. There's a lot of work going on to build repositories for data that are subject-oriented, and they tend to be very sophisticated and have a lot of goodwill from the research community, but they require a lot of support. Researchers are very busy, and a lot of them aren't particularly good with computer technology. So in the end, they need somebody they can talk to about how this is supposed to work and get them over the hurdles of it. And we found that a lot of times these large subject repositories just fail because at the end of the day, the researchers can't figure out how to use them effectively, and they give up. So here are libraries that have a long-standing tradition of subject specialists and liaisons to different departments who have a lot of subject expertise, even if they're not, personally experts in all of the research of their assigned areas. But they're quite willing and able to provide that kind of last-mile support, the training classes for graduate students, the, answering the reference question about how you can deposit your data set, a little bit of support service around metadata. So this last mile issue is something that libraries are almost uniquely positioned to help with and really gives us an advantage over these other approaches that have been tried if we're willing to go there. So now we see what this question is. How are you providing long-term access to the data as software to access and manipulate that data changes? So that was the conversation we had about the problems and challenges of archiving and preserving software. And as I explained then, there are strategies for that, like capture the source code for the software so that you can kind of migrate it forward in time, just like you would a text file. Document what the software did. That's very important. A lot of times you take a video of the screen experience, the user experience working with the software. So, there's a whole subfield of digital preservation that's working on preserving software. But in most cases, it hasn't been a practical issue for libraries so far. And it's only now, as we start to take in certain of these data formats, that we have this problem. But fortunately, we share the problem with the communities of practice that rely on that software and created them in the first place. So we hope that we can work together with those scientists and researchers to figure out how to preserve the software or migrate the formats to things that are a little more robust over time. Hopefully that answered the question. Yes, so just to close, because we're really out of time, I think that from my perspective, libraries are very well positioned to do more in this area. Like I said, we can build on what we've done for quite a long time, branch into new subject areas as resources and willingness allow, and begin to build the expectation that libraries do have an important role to play in managing and archiving research data in addition to research publications. And I think that's going to be very important to do because over time, the relationship between papers and publications and data is blurring. And the data is becoming as important as the papers. I'm sure a lot of you have heard that before, and it's no joke. It's true. So if we try to make the case that we're only responsible for archiving and managing publications and not data, then we will only be solving half the scholarly communication problem in the future. I've got another question here. Should this be a first or last mile issue? Should libraries get involved with researchers before they start their research to advise them on how to document it? And I think that you're absolutely right. This is a first and last mile issue in the sense that what I meant by last mile is that we are physically close to the researchers involved. They can walk down the hallway and talk to a person or interact with us locally. And that could happen at the front end when they're really writing their research proposal and trying to figure out what they should be doing, or it could happen at the very end of the project when they're trying to archive the data. And I think the way it'll probably work is that we'll start off by coming in at the end, and over time we'll convince people that we have a role to play at the beginning too, and we can begin to define some standards and best practices for the researchers that they'll benefit from. But right now there's a certain credibility gap that we need to work on first. Okay, so I believe that's the end of my presentation, and I just wanted to sort of make the point that once again, this is one of those areas where we've got a few feet down the path, and I think we need to make a decision about whether we're really on this road or not. But it seems to me that we already are, so we really need to, as a community, kind of get our heads around this and figure out what the right role is for libraries and repositories. And I thank you for your time, and it's tricky since I can't see anybody, but I think I do have one other question which we'll take before we end, and that says, thinking specifically about semantic encoding created by the scholar or the researcher and not the library, is that copyrightable? Yes, I think, well, not the actual encoding. If the data set is encoded in something like EML or CML, that markup is not copyrightable, but the work of creating the schema for how you want to organize your metadata, that schema may well be copyrightable. Typically they're not, or if they are copyrighted, they're made freely available through common licenses. But that's a good point, that you need to be careful about the difference between the data itself, which is just facts coming off an instrument, and how those facts are organized and interpreted, which might be copyrightable. Okay, so I will allow just another moment for questions in case anybody has any last thoughts. And if they do not, then I think we're well over time. So I'm going to draw to a close here and turn it back over to the organizers. Thank you very much.